One of the things I like to talk about today are a number of the books out there that are kind of predicting the that China has peaked and it's in a period of upcoming decline. The first book I remember written along these lines was by Gordon Cheng. This goes back probably over 20 years ago, and the book was called The Coming Collapse of China. And he was even quite specific. He said by 2011, China will have collapsed. Obviously, that turned out to be dead wrong. The most recent book on this subject is called The Danger Zone. The Danger Zone basically says, in a nutshell, that China is facing a number of very difficult challenges. So they point to debt, they point to the lack of consumer confidence, they point to challenges with neighbors. They talk to the aging population and the fact that China is not going to be growing new workers going forward to be able to get the work done, the property problem, and then finally underperforming SOEs. So if you read the beginning of the book, it basically says China is facing a series of challenges that it's not going to be able to respond to. Let's start with why I'm confident that China is going to deal with these challenges. I guess what I put forward as reason number one is just look at China's history. We're not going to go back far in history, but certainly if you start with the Civil War, the CCP had significant disadvantages in terms of manpower and military weaponry vis-a-vis the nationalists. And yet, because of strategy and being able to build the people's support around them, they were able to prevail. But at the end of the day, if you just look at the facts and go through all of those challenges from the Civil War, it's a track record that is pretty impressive. And then if you add on top of that, China brought 850 million people out of poverty and did so without getting involved in any external wars. It's a pretty impressive record. So anyone who basically says they question China's ability to meet the challenges that they face is not looking realistically at history. Because I would argue that there really isn't any major country on the globe today who looked at the challenges that China faced from 1949 up until the present and delivered more effectively, not just on each of those individual dimensions that I mentioned, but was over that period of time able to grow GDP at a level that was significantly higher than any other major country. If you look at the second underlying assumption between the books that are critical of China and believe it's peaked, they're basically asserting that we don't think China's leadership is going to be flexible, talented enough, courageous enough to be able to deal with these changes. But if you tear apart the way China governs itself, it's not unlike a very successful corporation. So you have a strong leader, you have people who are advanced meritocratically based on their education and what they have been able to accomplish in the outside world. You have a long-term strategic view that gets converted into industrial policy. So the country has been very effective at picking out where it wants to prioritize resources and initiatives that are going to be most successful in the marketplace. And then finally, if I think about the issue of pure talent, I mean, one of the great advantages that China has is that going back to Mandarin traditions for many, many centuries, the best and the brightest in China always aspire to government service. So you start out with the idea that the people who are senior in government are by nature highly educated and have been tested in many different professional settings and been successful. One of the great phrases I heard from one of my favorite politicians, Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore, basically said China is not a country. China is a civilization state. And what he meant by that was 92% of Chinese are Han, and the vast majority of them are steeped in Confucian values. So it gives a level of identity and cohesion to the Chinese people that is a very important force. I think if you then go more deeply into Confucian values, my favorite one is work hard to get ahead. Self-improvement is your number one objective through hard work and education, not for the benefit of you as an individual, but for the benefit of your family and society. And a lot of Westerners say, oh, well, Confucian values, those are from ancient times. I can tell you, having dealt with a lot of young Chinese people in America as well as in China, Confucian values are totally alive and well. And the final point I would make is, a lot of people will make the comparisons and say, oh, we've got the middle income trap, and that's what really hurt Japan at the end of the day. But China is a far less developed country than Japan was when it was going through its economic struggles. So if you look at urbanization, China today is 60% urbanized. Most mature countries are over 80% urbanized. That's a huge lift in productivity when you've got another 20% of the population that's yet to be urbanized. The same thing is true on income. If you look at Japan by comparison, Japan's income per person was not that different from the income in the United States. In China today, the income and GDP are both about a third of where the US's income and GDP are, which means there's an enormous amount of headroom going forward. So if I put all those pieces together and say, okay, here's a country with a track record of getting things done, an approach to governance with a quality of leaders, and an approach to making decisions, both strategic and operational, that leads to high levels of execution. And you've got a cohesive, large population that's supportive of national goals. So if I think about, going back to the theme in the beginning, has China peaked? Um, if you believe, like many in the West do, that China only succeeded because of stealing IP from the West and unfair trade deals, and has never really demonstrated the ability to innovate, um, that's a good story, but it doesn't square with the facts. And the reality is, China has a lot of strengths going for it.